So, recently, my life has kind of gone to hell. There's been a major shakeup in my family, I lost my job, and there's been a dozen other smaller things that have just been weighing on my shoulder, leading to no shortage of anxiety. So, I decided that now is probably about the best time I can just to let myself cut loose a little bit. When I normally criticize RWBY, especially in these longer, full-fledged, edited videos, I usually go pretty easy on it. I'm not like Fat Man. I can't be hypercritical. I can't do that for prolonged periods of time. But in this circumstance, I'm angry. I can't just try and highlight all the positives. I need to tear into something, and RWBY is just the prime cut on the chopping block. So if you've seen any of the Frostbite reaction videos, you know what's coming. I'm taking the gloves off. RWBY's getting the slaughter today.
However, I don't work like Fat Man. I don't operate purely based on logic. I operate based on cinematic suspense and tension, on gut feelings versus mental thought, so it makes it almost impossible to really put words to my analysis. That is, unless I have counterweights with which to compare. In comes My Hero Academia and Little Witch Academia, two shows that I think perfectly capture the essence of what Rooster Teeth and Monty originally promised with RWBY and ultimately failed to deliver. These two shows have given to me, as an audience member, every ounce of satisfaction that I felt cheated out of when I decided to dedicate my time to RWBY. Hell, if I didn't make my benchmark trying to fix the damn show, I probably would have dropped it back in Volume 4. Meanwhile, I'm frothing at the mouth for the next season of My Hero Academia, and I'm more than ready to storm Trigger Studios to demand a second season of Little Witch Academia. But the reason I bring in these two shows is that there's a similar plot structure involved in each, at least to a certain point, and the way that each story diverges shows what paths RWBY had open to it that ultimately went to waste. So I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, My Hero Academia and Little Witch Academia vs. RWBY. Spoiler warning for all three of these shows, announce thyself. Let's get a little grounding here, because I'm touching on three distinct fan bases right now, and even though there's a significant portion of overlap between them, I feel there may be some people tuning in from one of the dozen sites I taught this on that will have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about in relation to at least two of these shows. I know everyone hates recaps, but please bear with me just so everyone is up to speed. All three shows, to some extent, feature a wide-eyed protagonist looking to attend a dream school that will teach them some fantastical skill that ends up embroiling them in a magic world full of conflict. Along the way, they assemble a whole host of friends and allies, meet an assortment of antagonists, and fight against the odds to prove that them getting into the school in the first place wasn't just some kind of fluke before ultimately tackling some sort of big bad later on. J.K. Rowling, eat your goddamned heart out. However, there is some significant variation between the three. My Hero Academia focuses around the concept of superhumans as an everyday occurrence, with the main protagonist wanting to become a hero in order to fight villains who have chosen to use their powers, their quirks, for evil. Little Witch Academia, meanwhile, focuses on magic and a school that teaches students how to use it in everyday application, or in situations where magic is an exclusive necessity, with the main protagonist gearing to be a performer in order to reignite the world's love for magic in general. Finally is RWBY, which focuses on a world beset by monsters of darkness and the brave heroes that stand up to fight that darkness in order to make their world more livable. The main character being a youth who wants to... This actually segues right into my first major issue with RWBY as a series. Ruby Rose is one of the most underdeveloped main characters I have ever seen in my life, and I've played through all of Prototype, so I assure you that's an accomplishment. The fact that she is the main character is absolutely baffling, let alone a main character. At best, her motivations are some of the shallowest on the planet, with idolizing the huntsman in her childhood storybooks being the only concrete motivation we're ever really given. This motivation provides no demonstrable goal for her as a character, no endpoint for her to strive towards, just what amounts to getting a college certificate and killing monsters. Beyond that, there's nothing else for us to go on, leaving the character an emptier vessel than the titular egg of Angel's Egg. Now, astute viewers of the show may try to piece together some motivation inspired by her dead mother, who was also a huntress, but we're never given anything to work with concretely in those terms. It's been about 5 volumes, and the most we know about their dynamic is that RWBY keeps her mom filled in on the skeleton of a plot the show has going for it. That's about it. Now, that's not saying going to a school for a diploma isn't a relatable motivation. Hell, Harry Potter didn't really have any kind of grand aspirations when he went to Hogwarts, but the audience needs something bigger to eventually latch onto in order to invest them in the protagonist, and that eventuality never really comes for RWBY. Compare that to, say, Deku from My Hero Academia. From episode 1, we get a very clear picture of who Deku is. A young, powerless boy hoping, dreaming, borderline deluding himself into thinking he'll become a great hero like his idol All Might. We see snippets of him as a child, of the formative moments of his life, of the tragedy that drives him to be the best person he can be, the best hero, and how, in the face of impossible odds, he holds onto that dream of becoming the greatest hero ever. We're even told at the end of episode 2 that he does indeed fulfill his dream. Combine that with actually seeing All Might performing at not even a fraction of his full power at the end of season 1, and we as an audience have a pretty clear endgame that we get to see Deku strive towards. Side note, people wanted me to add that to my flaws video on My Hero Academia, the fact that we're told outright that Deku succeeds, that is, and there's really not a problem to be had with it. Prefacing a story with a conclusion is a ballsy move, but nothing new. In fact, it harkens back to old minstrel stories and ancient Greek plays, which slots the story in alongside plenty of other actual epic tales. Point of fact, not only does telling us he succeeds give us a direction to look in as an audience, it tells us point blank that it's the journey itself that is more interesting than its conclusion. So with that settled, I'm going to get back to my main points. What I'm trying to get at with all this is that we know where Deku was, where he is now, and where he is going. We understand what drives him, what challenges him, and what limits he needs to overcome in order to succeed. Similarly, we have Akko from Little Witch Academia who won't shut up about her goals and dreams, to the point where other characters both ridicule and shite her for it. Compared with Deku, she's a complete reversal of personality. We learn most of what we know about Deku from internal monologue and decisive action. He's quiet, contemplative, and not very confident in skills he hasn't had time to really master. Meanwhile, you have Akko, who never seems to be able to keep her thoughts inside her head. She's impetuous, spontaneous, and her interest in just about anything outside of her main goal fluctuates on a dime, which immediately sinks her into the delinquent category at her school. These two couldn't be more different, and yet we can see quite a lot of parallel. Akko was inspired by her hero Shiny Chariot during childhood, and sought out Luna Nova, the school where Chariot learned magic, in order to directly follow in her footsteps. There, she inherited the same responsibility as her idol, and were given a clear number of indications where her path is going. She wants to become a performer, so she'll need to actually buckle down and learn the magic, even if it's boring more often than not. She needs to use the shiny rod to revive the dwindling supply of magic around the world, by not only discovering the words of power that fuel it, but also genuinely learning to understand them. And in combining those two motivations, she wants to revive the world's passion and adoration for magic in light of its diminishing significance. We are set these goals by episode 3 of the series, and we can see how it motivates or overwhelms Akko at each turn as the weight of her desires and responsibilities begin to build up on her. The fun of the show is watching her tackle each problem in tow, either by learning something new about her friendships, herself, or the nature of the world around her. Now compare those two to RWBY, who just wants to be a huntress. Do you see where I'm going with this? There's no dynamic, there's no struggle in RWBY's arc, there's not even a RWBY's arc. We've just now wrapped Volume 5, and RWBY has had her first instance of genuine character development, and even then it felt like much of that was forced. We get no internal monologue regarding her thoughts on the events occurring around her, and we practically get nothing during her interactions with the other characters that indicate there's anything more beyond her surface motivations. She's a husk, built and packaged to look like a main character and fill the role of a main character, but with none of the underlying mechanics that make a main character genuinely engaging. It's this problem that makes John such an issue for the series and the fandom. He's a side character that gets way more focus than he should, at least from a logical perspective, but that's because there's nothing that the writers have actually given RWBY herself to work with. John was simply given a lot more to go on, with the familial expectations, romantic interests in other members of the cast, conflicted feelings about his place in the academy, and it's very easily argued that it's because he's a self-insert of the writer Miles Luna. And for the record, I've seen the Reddit AMA. It's more than possible to write a self-insert character without realizing it. Hell, even when you're aware of it, it doesn't mean you've escaped writing one. Take that one to the bank from my own personal experience. But what we end up with is a void of a main character where events and stories happen around her but never of her own volition. There's no proactivity, there's no energy, RWBY does nothing to affect the main plot in any significant way, and if you remove her from the story and put the onus on someone like Weiss or Jean, you'd wind up with almost the exact same set of events. Hell, the one villain death she actually has to her name wasn't even her kill. He had to be killed by a Grimm. His death was thematically fitting, a string of words that I'm surprised actually coalesce around this show, but it was also a shame because Roman Tordrick was one of the best damned things about the show before he got the axe. The other villains don't hold up anywhere near as well as the mysterious, suave, and dynamic Roman. Instead, most of them fall into a general archetype and sit there for most of their screen time. I can give some credit to Emerald, who seems to be cracking under the pressure of being in league with, the devil, but everyone else? We've got a completely flat, monotone quote-unquote seductress whose best moments all came when she literally couldn't speak, a generic suave British man who didn't even want to be there, an asshole, generic revenge story number 353, how not to write the Joker in one convenient package, and, oh yeah, the literal devil! Now, admittedly, they're kinda holding back on Salem for the future, and since she's shaping up to be the big baddie, I can understand that. It's similar to how little they've really touched on All for One in My Hero Academia so far, so I'm not going to bitch about her. And speaking of My Hero Academia, its rogue gallery doesn't fare quite as well in comparison to RWBY at this particular point, what with most of the villains introduced being quite literally fodder for the heroes to wade through before getting to the really big baddies. Shigaraki is obviously one of the standouts, since we actually get a peek into his own thoughts on the world in a similar way that we get a look into Deku's. And the fact that his convictions and ideologies don't fully solidify until the close of Season 2 is rather interesting to see for a villain. Normally something like that is saved for a hero who has turned to the dark side, so it shows a particular growth in him as he refines the purpose of his own villainy. And this is to say nothing of hero killer Stain, who has a particular idea of what a hero should be and how all the fame and fortune that has come with its emergence as a profession has tainted its purity. The fact that both him and Shigaraki were played off each other was a masterstroke that let us see two different evil extremes come head to head and understand some of the strange twists of philosophy that influenced their madness. Now, in the current show, we don't know much about them beyond those ideologies, and I'll remind you that I've still not read the manga, so I don't know how exactly these two get developed, if at all, in Stain's case. I also know there are more villains coming in Season 3, and I'm excited to see them, but I've only got so much to work with here at the moment. The show has primarily spent its time developing the hero side of the cast, interchanging different characters as soft antagonists for Deku to bounce off of, so the villain side of the roster hasn't exactly been left a lot of breathing room to develop fully quite yet. It still leagues in a way better than the bloated one-dimensional rogues gallery in RWBY, but the villains have left less of an impact than one would assume in a superhero show. Then there's Little Witch Academia, which has a number of small antagonists across its run, but it ultimately boils down to one big antagonist pulling the strings in the background. Croy, and yes, I know I'm pronouncing it wrong, please blame effective marketing and not ignorance, is a fascinating character to pick apart. Prideful, intelligent, and a prodigy at magic. Her motivations both create and end up helping solve the ultimate conflict of the show, and it's very apparent that her work in the field of magitech is jumping the world of magic into a new age. She's a wonderful expression of the misguided idealist and the arrogant savant, not only striving for a better world by restoring magic back to its full capacity, but also believing that she is the only person smart enough to actually accomplish that task. That mixes in beautifully with the jealousy over Chariot being chosen by the Claim Solace, and it follows a very logical path that ends up ruining their friendship and any number of lives around the globe. After being told all her life how smart she was, praised for being a genius, the genius of her generation, it's all the more bitter when, at the very end, she finds that the only thing she can't do is the one thing that she had set her heart on doing all along. And when that happens, everything she's done comes crashing down on her. Now, admittedly, I don't think she quite got the breakdown that she deserved, but then again, there were some pretty dire circumstances surrounding her at the time, so I won't blame her for having a bigger fish to fry. She's one of those villains that genuinely makes me think that the writers were really looking at her as a hero of her own story, just corrupted by ambition and conceit. It's rather popular knowledge that that is how you write a good villain, but it very rarely seems to be implemented. My Hero Academia does something to that effect with Shigaraki and very directly with Stain, but it's clear that their ideals came before the characters, whereas it feels much more natural in Croy's case of someone being good, changed by outside pressures that lead them down a misaligned path. Meanwhile, in RWBY, yeah, so maybe Hazel sees himself as a hero, since he thinks Ozpin is evil? Not sure how he justifies working with murderers and the literal devil! I don't think Cinder sees herself as a hero, but then again, it's been about 5 volumes and we still don't know thing one about her, and might never if they actually decide to keep her dead at the end of this volume. But that's a toss-up. Again, Emerald is maybe the closest to being this, what with her being a street rat in over her head, but it's pretty clear that Mercury, Tyrion, and Watts are all pretty content with slaughtering people wholesale in order to achieve their ends, so I have no hope of seeing them actually develop beyond their current roles. Oh, hey, I completely forgot about Adam. He sure is a thing. Probably has the backstory that could be the most closely described as a hero gone wrong. all boiled down to being blue-balled by his cat waifu. Seriously. A political terrorist with the aims of stopping racism, and the most interesting thing about him is the fact that his girlfriend left him for a Goku cosplayer. And speaking of Yang, can we talk about how absolutely inconsistent everyone in RWBY actually is? Please? I mean, I used to think that RWBY was being consistent, but it's kinda hard to have texture of any kind when there's no substance to a character. And geez, when there actually is something to go off, it's almost immediately contradicted. Yang goes from bipolar to an empty shell to suddenly someone very beloved by an entire nation or something. All at the drop of a hat with none of it properly built to. Even the PTSD arc they had lined up for her after Volume 3 got wrapped up pretty cleanly in Volume 4, leaving her with like 2 scenes of shaky hands in Volume 5. And yeah, I know they're supposed to be planning more with her in that regard, but PTSD doesn't just fade into the background after a few months. It's a consistent threat to a person's mental and physical well-being. Giving her a few minutes of jitters only reminds us of a better storyline they managed to pull off in the previous volume. Weiss goes from being a competent one-on-one fighter to being completely defenseless without being able to summon. Blake is incredibly confrontational and forward with her agenda, but is apparently also a coward somehow. And Ren goes from being literally the least talkative character in the show to being one of the most talkative without any rhyme or reason. For what little consolation it's worth, Nora and Jean are probably the 2 most consistent characters in the show, though they certainly still have their moments of bizarre characterization. Nora is incredibly flanderized with each volume to the point that she's more like a stereotypical Genki girl than a character at this point. And John is more or less reliable all the way through, but that's not really something to be proud of since he's reliably grating. And considering he's the one character that's most frequently bumping RWBY herself out of the main character's spot, that's a problem in and of itself. You shouldn't be highlighting your flawed characters if they're initially designed to be annoying. Looking to My Hero Academia, there are 2 characters in specific, Minata and Yuga, that are both incredibly annoying. However, they're in the show primarily for comic relief purposes and often serve as the butt of the joke, which is incredibly cathartic, given that they also don't get much screen time compared to a healthy sum of the main cast, and you've got yourself a well-designed attack strategy to have the humor come in and strike the audience, fading away just before it becomes genuinely irritating. But looking to that greater sum of cast members, there's a lot of really creative standouts. There's of course Uraraka, a girl driven by her desire to fund comfortable lives for her parents, who along the way develops a noticeable crush on our plucky main character. Then there's Bakugo, the main rival driven by a sense of pride, so much so that I'm wondering if maybe they're going to take him down a similar path that Little Witch did with Croy. Todoroki proves to be the next really big powerhouse of drama with his daddy issues, and that's followed quite closely with Ida, who strives to follow in his big brother's footsteps. Beyond that are a dozen other characters that all have fleshed out backstories just waiting to be told in full, like Suyu and Momo. Rounding this out is All Might as a mentor figure and deuteragonist trying to lead their classes alongside his fellow teachers. Hey RWBY fans, remember when teachers were a thing? Ha! Neither do I! Though I guess I can't complain too badly since that's probably where Little Witch Academia suffers the most in comparison to My Hero Academia. Very few professors or adults get completely fleshed out beyond Professor Ursula, with maybe a one-off episode dedicated to 2 of them, sort of, in the 20-episode run. Similarly, the other students at the school aren't quite as fleshed out as those in My Hero, as Little Witch is much more interested in a tighter collection of characters, including Akko, Diana, Chariot, and Croy. This isn't to say they don't have characters, just that more often than not, it's left up to single-episode shenanigans for us to really see them shine. Lot gets maybe 2 or 3 episodes, Sushi gets around 3, Amanda gets 1, Constance gets 1, and hell, Jasminka, Hannah, and Barbara didn't get a single episode dedicated to them throughout the series. Out of all of them, Diana is probably the most fleshed out side character, and it's practically the show's deuteragonist. She serves as Akko's near-perfect foil, a rival that dismisses the notion of rivalry at the beginning, but comes to fondly accept it as a form of friendship after the final turnaround of her arc. Dare I say it, the dynamic has an almost eerie resemblance to RWBY and Weiss, to the point that I'd recommend actually watching Little Witch Academia to any other White Rose shippers like myself. The burgeoning shipping fandom around the 2 is small but tight-knit, and ripe with quality work that will satisfy just about every itch that the White Rose teasing from RWBY has left in its wake. Seriously, check it out, you'll thank me later. Back on track, despite only a few characters getting very close focus, the surrounding characters all make do with the screen time they get. They're very well balanced in their appearances through the series, and we get a great feel for who they as people are. Lot is the quiet, bookworm mediator that tries to keep the peace, but has her own set of opinions that often run counter to what people want. Suchi is the insane alchemist who is into some questionable things given her expressions at the Samhain Festival. Amanda is the daredevil with a penchant for dancing, Constance is the erstwhile tinkerer, and Jasminka is the insanely strong glutton. They all make a motley crew for sure, but damned if I don't love each and every one of them. None of them break character or go outside of themselves, and hell, Suchi herself is actively changed thanks to Akko's meddling in her mind, which explains away what would have been unusual behavior for her later down the line. It's absolutely clear to me that the writers were keeping track of their characters and what they did, as opposed to RWBY, which seems to arbitrarily change the characters' personalities in order to serve the scene. That is, if the scene itself makes sense to begin with. RWBY is one of the most strangely structured shows I've ever seen on just about every level. First, it's not only divided into seasons, but also volumes, and the only time I've ever seen that done is when companies release a collection of a show's episodes during or just after the show's run. Never once have I seen a yearly release schedule structured in that way. But beyond that, you've got all the pacing issues. Half of Volume 1 is the series' introduction episodes, and the second half is comprised of 2 character arcs and 1 kind of plot arc. Volume 2 feels more uneven, with 3 different arcs that are all connected by the most tenuous of threads, that being Blake's anxiety over a bad guy that at this point had been thoroughly trounced 3 consecutive times. Volume 3 was first all about the tournament, then it was all about the attack on Beacon. Volume 4 was all over the place in its randomly placed vignettes about each girl and their own little stories, and Volume 5 was by far one of the slowest things I've ever watched in my life, and you're looking at a man who coaches mock goddamn trial! Only 2 of these volumes have an actual beginning, middle, and end, that being the latter 2, which indicates that at the very least they're learning, but the rest are just a mishmash of events that rarely play off each other in any coherent way. It's like they've been trying to write a serialized story, but only bothered to look up the definition when they finished Volume 3. Just humor me, and play Season 1 of My Hero Academia and Season 1 of RWBY back to back, and you'll see how absolutely uneven the entirety of the series actually is. My Hero Academia doesn't necessarily have the best pacing in the world for a serialized story, but it has a legitimate excuse since it's being adapted from a different medium. Hiccups will happen, especially like that strange pacing issue in Season 2, but RWBY has no such excuse beyond just incompetence. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Little Witch Academia, which is far less serialized and much more episodic, but it does keep a through-line narrative. In this way, it's actually rather similar to Volume 1, what with its individual character episodes and small thematic arcs, though handled far better by all accounts, even managing to hold 2 distinct character arcs for the main character in its full run time. Maybe RWBY should have eschewed the entire serialized path and gone for a more pseudo-episodic route like this, but I'm not sure it would have been handled any better. Maybe if they had gone that route, we would have had more time to breathe in the world and wouldn't have needed the World of Remnants in the first place. Which, can I say, those are the absolute laziest way I've ever seen any show deliver exposition. Not even the hammiest of stilted, boxy deliveries could pierce the hide of the monotonous info dumps those things are. At first, I thought they were just there to supplement fan curiosity, give more detail to the world that we'd never get to see in the show proper, or wouldn't until much further down the line. But Christ, almost every utterance from them is either also explained in the show or completely contradicted later on. Sure, the settings of My Hero Academia and Little Witch Academia aren't the most fleshed out, but they don't need to be. They introduce all the elements important to the storyline and use those to build up a sense of atmosphere and character, and those elements maintain internal consistency throughout. We are told early on the variance between quirks, how some people have amazing powers and some people have abilities that are practically useless, and with that simple concept we can get a whole spread of unique characters to play with. We can see how powerful and crazy magic can get when used in the hands of a proper witch, yet we also are made keenly aware that there is a set limit and range on their abilities that keep them tethered to a specific location, and in fact gives Akko her primary goal in the form of restoring magic to an omnipresent force instead of one limited by distance and magic glowing rocks. In RWBY though, every element of the lore is just plagued by question and inconsistency. The rules for semblances are like a strictly worse version of quirks that fluctuate in scale, and the question of why only huntsmen seem to have or use semblances is relevant multiple times but never addressed. Meanwhile, the rules for dust, magic, technology, aura, and semblance all skew together into a hodgepodge of madness, with very little distinguishing what each element can do and what limitations each facet of the world has. In comparison, we know that Luna Nova is one of the few schools around the world still teaching magic because magic has become archaic and trivialized in the face of technology, especially with the limitations on energy consumption. Hell, one of the selling points of Croy is that she has found a way to bring the two together to improve both, which shows the world itself trying to grow and improve like it naturally would. In RWBY, all we get is, make a bigger robot. Great. Thanks. Glad someone finally thought to put tanks against the monsters devouring our world. There's only one point I think RWBY has an edge against the two, and that's with the introduction of aura as a concept. But even then, it comes with the biggest damn asterisk I can slap on the damned thing. In principle, a force that protects the user from harm in order to facilitate overblown action sequences fixes every complaint I have had with the Maid of Iron trope. But in the show, it's so poorly mishandled to the point where it's never clear if the fighter is actually in danger or if their aura is actually protecting them. I have a greater sense of threat to Uraraka in her fight against Bakugo than I do between Crow and Tyrion in Volume 4, and yet the former is just one of the better fights in My Hero Academia, while the latter is quite possibly the pinnacle of RWBY's combat scenes. This also doesn't necessarily put much of a dent in Little Witch because it's grounded less in physical reality and operates more on 1920s cartoon logic, so the characters are about as rubber as bouncy balls. Just slap them into a wall and watch them ricochet around the room. Don't worry, they'll be fine. So long as the slapstick helps better inform us about the relationships between characters and the setting, it's more than acceptable. It's really a damned shame that RWBY isn't better. There are a lot of great concepts in there that tell me there's a genuinely amazing story just sitting underneath the surface, but it's buried under incompetence and filler. I am so happy to have found both My Hero and Little Witch Academia because both shows have taken the concepts that have been choked by RWBY and brought them to fruition. A vast array of fun, colorful characters that serve a purpose to the plot, a wide-eyed, innocent but savvy protagonist taking on threats larger than life, close-knit bonds between friends, and awesome action sequences that display a mastery of animation by all those involved. If it weren't for that one piece of dropped potential with Aura, I'd probably die happy seeing everything coalesce so well between these two shows. I just wish we could have gotten those promises fulfilled sooner with Monty Oom's dream project, and it makes me angry that we haven't. The best thing I can say about what we got is that it's been nice to vent my rage a little more than I normally do, because boy has it helped me cool off in light of some turbulent times ahead of me. Thank you all for watching. As always, these are only my opinions on the matter and my own personal critique, so feel free to agree or disagree as you see fit down in the comments below. If you liked what you watched here, please subscribe for more content like it. A huge shout out to all of my patrons who are slowly but steadily helping me make this a full-time job, and a reminder that patrons of any amount, $1 or larger, get access to the Frostbite Discord server. And who knows what the future holds. Maybe one day we'll get a unified show that capitalizes on all this promise sometime down the line. With how well My Hero Academia and Little Witch Academia were handled, I can only hope that something like that will come along eventually. Until such time, I've been Raymond McNeil. Catch you all on the flip side.